This conference will now be recorded.
Hello, folks. My name is Brian Weaver. I'm the VP of Sales at NSA. I'd like to welcome you all to our webinar series number 37 of our professional series webinars. It is on a migration plan from SX.e GUI to Cloud Suite. And our presenter today is Mark Patterson. So welcome all. And again, if you do have questions, please enter them into the chat button during the session, and we'll make sure we get to those at the end of this session today. Please make sure your lines are muted. And Mark, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Fantastic. Thank you, Brian. Thanks everybody for joining here on a Friday afternoon. Appreciate it. Welcome to a typical project plan for SX.e GUI to CSD migration. So in this session, we will cover implementation methodology, identifying the major milestones, data migration, mod reviews, risk assessments, training methodology, as well as the final launch phase. So my name is Mark Patterson. I'm a senior business consultant for NSA. I have led ERP initiatives in the distribution sector for over 20 years with various Infor solutions, including SX.e specifically for the last 10. I've worked extensively with SX, TWL, F9, Storefront, as well as various business intelligence solutions. So congratulations, you are here because you are committed to, or at least considering migrating SX to the cloud. So you've come to the right place. Today we'll walk through the various stages of this project, starting with building your team. So you'll need to fill roles at various levels. Think high level, executive, steering committee, project management, business and technical consulting, and your functional champions. So for the steering committee, what is this? So this is your executive level involvement for the project. So whether you're big or small, this may vary considerably, but the project managers will be keeping the executives up to date. Typically, pre-scheduled meetings where you will identify the areas needing their support. So the role of the steering committee is provide resources to meet the project objectives, and then make the go, no-go calls throughout the project when problems come up. You'll need some project management internally as well as externally with your consulting partner. So typically the internal project manager has a very detailed project plan, and the external consulting company will have theirs, which may be comparable, much less detail. So the role of the PMs, well, is to ensure the overall objectives are met, coordinate resources, define and assign tasks, manage the scope, schedule, and budget of the project. Also to decide when to escalate issues to your steering committee. So advice here, a good internal dedicated project manager is the key to keeping your project on tasks. Good project management won't avoid problems, but it gives you early warning that things are going off, because there's targets. When you miss targets, you see them early on, you have more time to react. So business and technical consultants. Your consulting company will assign a lead business consultant to your project, and other consultants will be pulled as needed when their expertise is needed. So the role of the business consultant is to train the trainers, so which is your champions, and ensure that the post-training requirements are met. So issue support, workshops. Finally, your functional area champions. They will be driving the business process re-engineering, developing training materials, and training your end users. So before you can decide on what champions you require, you need to identify your company's major functional areas. These are the typical functional areas, but every company is very different or can be very different. So you've got your accounting, you've got your AR, AP, sales order processing, purchasing, inventory control, warehouse operations, sysadmin, of course, reporting or business intelligence, as you may call it. You may have even a dedicated training person, believe it or not, in some larger organizations. E-commerce may have a dedicated individual in the project. And then there's the other ones as well. So if you have production or kits, you may have a dedicated resource. Service warranty, pricing may be complex enough to deserve a dedicated position on the team. All of these, something to consider. So Now that you've defined your major functional areas, you know which roles you need to fill. So typically, you'll want the department head. Let's say the customer service manager, for example. You want them as on the project. But after all, I mean, they have the experience and the authority to make decisions about their department, and there'll be times that you won't be available. They won't be available to the extent needed for the duration of the project. It's not a problem. It doesn't have to be the department head. This role can easily be filled by someone else in the company if they are well supported. Number one criteria, they must be available for the role. This typically requires reducing their current day-to-day responsibilities, and that requires executive buy-in. So how available does someone have to be on the project? It could range from 30% of their time to 80% of their time throughout the project. It depends. An ambitious project with a short time frame will require more dedicated time, and a more spread out timeline with fewer deliverables will require less time. It also depends on the functional area. If your AR champion may not have a lot of changes from CSD, whereas your sales order processing champion may have a ton of changes in third-party integrations. So it depends on a few things. Help your champions succeed. If you're putting them in the job, you're putting them in the responsibility for a period of time during the project, make the required changes to their job responsibilities and communicate them to the people they work with. Make it official, send a communication, make it so they don't have to explain why they are not as available as they were in the past. So you have executive support. You've got a project manager inside and out with your consulting company. You've identified the functional areas and the corresponding champions. Now let's draft a plan. In general, this is a migration, not a new ERP. CSD, it's the same logic, right? The same business logic as SX.e. So like most upgrades, this can be as big or as small as you want, right? Not quite. Moving to the cloud is a little bit more than an upgrade. There's a lot of things changing here. For one, it means you no longer have access to your data. So you have limited ability to do custom mods. You have limited ability to run QDs. And some of your third-party integrations, which would work if you just did an upgrade, they may not work with CSD. So let's assume with the general milestones or deliverables that apply to everyone. So you've got the initiate phase of the project, just getting stuff going. You've got the data migration, champion training, business process reengineering, end user training, the go live phase. So let's dig into the first, initiate. So initiate, it's made up of the following. We're going to dig into each one of these, but in short, you've got the business operations review, we'll dig into that, project governance, identifying risks that apply to you, setting the culture for change, that's a big one, timeline guidelines, and the kickoff. So a BOR, or a business operations review. Typically a BOR is offered by your consulting company. At a minimum, it's an extensive questionnaire with supporting documentation. The results could be 60 to 100 pages covering each functional area of your business. But ideally, it's more than a questionnaire. It's also a process involving interviews with champions of each functional area in the business. So what's the objective of the BOR? Well, it's to define the current state of business processes. So how do you process sales orders, whether they're EDI or over the phone? How do you manage your purchasing? What about AR? What about your e-commerce? What about your warehousing? There's a lot of details that vary from one distributor to the next. So why do you want to document all this? There's a few reasons. You have different people involved in this project, internal and external, and you want everybody to have the same baseline knowledge. Internally, resources such as your champions will review the BOR. It ensures that your champions are aware of how the other departments function and what challenges they can expect. Don't forget, they're collaborating with other departments. It's important they know, and don't assume they know everything about your company just because they're in it. For external resources, such as NSA, the BOR would be read by all the involved consultants. For example, trainers, so they understand your needs from the beginning. Imagine you have a champion in a room with an external trainer, doesn't know the basics of your company and the functional area being trained on. The BOR helps the trainer to get up to speed on your needs right from the start. The BOR also generates recommendations, often lots of them. For improvements, Some may be optional, like maybe you should use the bank rec feature in the new CSD, or maybe some mandatory recommendations, such as your BI doesn't work with CSD. So these recommendations then will make up a large number of the tasks on your resulting project plan. So the BOR process also discovers potential gaps between your system functionality and your needs, identifies project risks, as well as new features to implement. Once the BOR is complete, it's presented to the executives so they get an idea of what this project entails. Project governance. These are the procedures and structures put in place to keep the project on task. So we have clients of 60 to 600 plus employees. Every organization is different, and the larger the organization, the greater the justification for a more formal governance. But here are a few ideas. One would be to set up a steering committee made up of the internal executives with an NSA or your consulting company's executive. Schedule a monthly call with these executives where the agenda is to review the high-level items. Are we on target? Are we on budget? What are the risk areas today? How can we help? You get an early warning when anything starts to go off target, and you've got it supported from the top. Number two, schedule weekly meetings between the champions and the internal project managers to ensure the champions are progressing on tasks on time. Remember, the job of the PM is to get them help where needed. Third idea here, schedule weekly meetings between the internal and external consultant to confirm the tasks are progressing as planned. Overall, the required frequency to meet will ebb and flow with the project, sometimes monthly, other times daily. And your PMs will gauge this and gauge what's required and adjust as they go throughout the project. My preference is to pre-schedule the meetings, and if all is good, cancel them. It's a lot harder to get people's time, though, in the last minute when things are on fire. So, objective, identify high-level issues early, adjust the plan as needed, and have a clear path for escalation and keep the project on task. So, project risks. So these are the major ones on the screen. I got about 6 of them here. Resource availability. So despite the best intentions, your project resources can get pulled back into their daily jobs. Staffing changes. This project can go from 6 to 18 months, depending on the company and the initiatives. This is a long time. It's a long enough time for people to leave. You have new hires. Basically, life happens. So you'll have to deal with that. Competing projects. Identify these early. It could be anything from mergers to acquisitions to new branches opening to new product lines to getting rid of old product lines. All of these are important, but they can derail your project. Change management, the openness or lack of to do things differently. This is a tough one. Expect it and identify it and address it. The tough part is identifying when someone has a valid concern that something they don't want to change versus someone with a default aversion to all change. The key is a top-down message that we are here to adapt to the system and not the system to us, and therefore change is part of the game. Scope creep. This is where you add more and more tasks as you progress through the project. You'll want to deploy new features that come up, fix that old process. Remember, change takes time and effort, especially when it crosses multiple departments. Identify these. Be prepared to postpone to subsequent phases so it doesn't delay your project. Executive buy-in or support. There will be changing priorities over the project life. Acquisitions, pet projects, wanting to do more. Be realistic. Engage executive support if you think things are getting off track. By the way, these are the predictable risks. There's also the less predictable. Over the years, NSA has dealt with many types of surprises, from Hurricane Katrina to week-long power outages, snowstorms that shut the city down for a week, and who knows, even maybe a global pandemic one day. Overall, expect the unexpected, and we'll adapt as we go along. I love this one. Be the change ambassador. Get this message out and from the beginning and repeat it. The project team should be consistent in their communication. Talk about the project at every opportunity. Manage expectations. Things will get done, but in due time. Not everything will get fixed day one. Manage employees' concerns as they arise. An important one here, focus on the optimal ways of working, not replicating what we do today. So have that message come from the top down. So there's no justification for just we've always done it this way, let's keep doing it. You got to break that and know it's supported from the top down. So we've got milestones, we've got the team, we've got the deliverables. How do you determine your launch date? So each company has blackout periods. So peak seasons or vacation times, trade shows. So be realistic, factor these in when you're determining your best launch date. A few things to keep in mind. If you want to launch in September, you're going to be affected by your summer vacation. You may be willing to give up your summer vacation this year, but you've got dozens of people involved who may feel differently. January launches are affected by December holidays. So launching Jan 1 may not be a great idea. And how about the blackout periods of maybe your external resources? Know those as well. Above all, expect the unexpected. Be ready to adapt. The last step of the initiate phase is the kickoff. So you've got an initial project draft. You've started the BOR. You've defined your governance strategy, and you've identified possible risks. So you've got an idea what your project's what's going on now. It's time for a kickoff. So a kickoff is a meeting of all the stakeholders. So it's your executives, your project team, both internal and external, including your champions. Get them together, do this early. It makes the project official, and it sends the message that this project is priority and has executive support. Every meeting should have an agenda. So in this meeting, prepare to review the high-level project plan in this kickoff meeting itself. The major tasks, the milestones, the deliverables. Review and sensitize executives to the current and potential risks. Throughout the kickoff, or through this kickoff, the leadership learns what's involved, still declares it a priority. Discuss the scope. What's included, and just as importantly, or maybe more importantly, what's not included. You have a limited budget, you have a firm launch date, that means you have a firm scope. This means you'll have to say no sometimes when things change. So manage this from the beginning. Plant this seed during the meeting. CSD won't solve everyone's problems on day one. If nothing else, moving to CSD is a new foundation to make the future improvements possible. Also, little word of advice, don't lump all your promises into phase 2. Remember, when you say, remember what you say, people remember what you say and will call you on it during phase 2. So maybe say something instead of phase 2 saying, let's do this during a subsequent phase. So the initiate phase is complete. The next major milestone is the data migration. So what's involved? So you have to get your GUI data to the cloud. So to do this, you copy the GUI production to GUI test, and then Infor takes your GUI test and moves it to the CSD environment. So typically, you'll perform this migration 3 times throughout the project. The first is so that the champions can be trained on your data in CSD. The second time you migrate a few months later is so your end user training is on your latest data. And the third, probably final, would be for your launch weekend. Everything gets copied in a migration. Keep this in mind, even inactive companies. So time to delete the old companies, time to purge. When I first heard about that, I thought to myself, why would we purge data? Disk space is cheap, right? I haven't purged in a decade or more. Well, the more data you have, the more time it takes to copy over to the cloud. This is important, especially during a compressed and busy launch weekend. So a purge can make the difference between taking 30 hours to copy your data over and maybe half that. So during a launch weekend, this can make a difference. So knowing this, you really need 10 years history. So if you are going to purge, you've made the decision to purge, start early. It takes more time than you expect. Purge programs are done first in test, and then when everything's okay, you repeat the process in live, which, guess what, has to be done during scheduled downtime. So it's important to go through this process. I've seen a few instances where there was just monsters in the closet. That's huge tables that had ballooned over the years. You don't know about it in your on-prem environment, but you'll trip across it when you start moving your data. So whether you have API tables that are communicating with your e-commerce applications that have been ballooning, review and know your table sizes before migrating. Another word of advice, deactivate your master records if you're not using them. So that's the inventory or customer or pricing or user profiles that are just no longer required. take the time, go through it, deactivate them. So start now and don't underestimate the time and effort required. Champion training. So I'm assuming you've all heard of Infor Campus training solution. So Infor Campus is very good for the basics, but you'll need more. We refer to this as scenario-based training, performed typically by your consulting company. We also refer to this as consultative training, where we encourage a dialogue during the training to incorporate examples that apply in the champion's daily work. For your training, expect between 20 and 30 possible training sessions. Seems like a lot, but if you think about it, you've got your AR, AP, GL integration, sales order processing, pricing, mass maintenance, vendor pricing, inventory control, warehousing with tons of different elements to it. There's a lot. So from a few hours each for some what's new training, like what's changed between GUI and CSD, to as much as a day or two of training for if you're taking on a new module. Overall, plan for about 6 to 8 weeks to complete your training. Best practice training is done on your data, right? We also encourage practicing immediately after the training. So for this reason, don't try to cram all your training sessions in a very tight week or period. Many of your champions will attend sessions outside their direct responsibility, and scheduling your sessions back to back makes it difficult for them to practice afterwards. Remote or online training, thanks to COVID, has its benefits, but one downside is that attendees can get distracted during these long sessions. They may start reading their texts or emails and stuff like this. So word of advice, don't cram sessions back to back, allow for breaks. And as a trainer, I know facial expressions confirm understanding. So encourage people to leave their videos on during training session. Really helps the trainer confirm what speed are they going at, is it adequate, and is the material understood. You may also want to plan for subsequent deep dive workshops as well for some areas where you want to consider new features or process changes. On the topic of training, something new here. You should schedule training on something new called personalizations and extensibility. So something new to CSD. So personalization for example, is the modifying of your screen. So it's moving fields around, it's changing the shading, it could be conditional shading, it's kind of the softer stuff. Changing the order of fields in a grid are good examples. Extensions. These involve modifying a screen to add scripts to either add or populate the field values. Extensibility is likely key in your effort to replace minor customization. So keep this in mind. So let's say your training's been done, your champions have been trained, it's time to tackle the big one, and that's business process reengineering. It's a single line in my simple plan that we're covering today, but this is a big one with all the details in it. You have to deal with modification replacement, or you have to deal with whether you're implementing some new features. You may have some third-party integration changes. You may have previously manual processes that you now decided to do within the system, and all this equals process change. Mod replacements. Start early on this one. So if you still have them, get your custom mod specs. But if you're like most, they're outdated. Changes have been made since the original specs were drawn up, or not the entire spec was delivered. So you may have to dig deep to understand what was changed and why. So on the topic of mods, eliminate where possible. Don't assume they are still required. Challenge them. Sometimes you can outgrow a mod and you find it simply no longer used. Always start with the question, what is this mod? And prove to me you still need it. Furthermore, do an ROI analysis or return on investment analysis. Ask the tough questions. If a mod costs you 10 grand to develop it, but it saves someone a few hours a week of data entry, it'll take you 10 years to make your money back. So ask, what does the mod save and what would the workaround be, so you know how much effort to put into finding a replacement. If you're lucky, you'll have an option to replace an old mod with some new CSD functionality, but be open-minded. It may not be an exact fit. So as a note, remind everyone, the goal here is to focus on optimal ways of working, not replicating what we do now. You may be able to replace mods with extensibility, as I mentioned before. So get trained on extensions and or get expert help. QDs are another one. Don't forget them. I've seen between 300 and 1,200 QDs at a company or at various companies. Start early on these. You may be able to move some QDs to the cloud, but if you're going to do it, you need Infor OK, so you'd want to start early. Forms, pick notes, packing slips, invoice, statements, purchase orders. I could go on and on. Start early. Many people leave this to the end. Get your intro training on forms. After that, print out your CSD forms, compare them to your current GUI forms, and get the Sharpie out and start marking them up. And when you've decided you've got to make changes, you can either bring them to a workshop, let's say for your training, go through them and get some help. From there, you need to determine whether you're going to prefer to do your own form changes, engage a third party, or some combination of the two. Reporting. If you get lucky, your reporting or BI solution has a CSD solution and you're fine. If not, you're going to have to roll up your sleeves and find a champion to develop your new reporting solution. Some advice: start simple and don't rebuild everything just because it existed before. And teach people how to fish on their own if your reporting solution offers such an option. For example, if you have a cube or something, a solution that allows you to slice and dice, let's say sales, for every possible dimension and measure, teach them how to use it, the department, the users. You don't have to pre-save every single possible combination of a cube if you can recreate it in 2 clicks. Third-party integrations. It's another big one. You may assign a functional area champion depending on the details here. As always, start as soon as possible. CSD does not permit direct access to data. You may have to work using APIs, data lake, extensions. As mentioned, current solutions may cease to be an option. So you may have to learn to deploy new tools here to rebuild what you had. Again, be early out of the gate for identifying solutions and check with Infor and your partner for recommendations. Many of the EDI and e-com vendors have already done integrations with CSD, so contact them. The conference room pilot, or the CRP. So you've come a long way. All the parts are in place, but do they flow? Have there been oversights? So this is the process to expose these. So get the functional area champions together in a real or virtual conference room. Take each functional area and test the process from beginning to end. So from PO to payment, from quote to cash. Test all the order sources, whether the order's coming in from EDI or B2B or phone or being imported, and then all the possible order types that you have, whether they're drop ships and pack and holds, prepaids. Every single one of them should be tested. Adjust your business processes and then finalize your end user training materials as the differences are exposed in your CRP. Your partners and lead consultants that are working with you will provide tips and tricks that they've gleaned from their own experience in previous migrations. Word of advice: whether you come across a bug or an enhancement request, it's important to get the request into Infor as soon as possible. Infor can move quickly in identifying and resolving issues in subsequent CSD patches. So high priorities need to get to Infor, and if they agree on the priority, you can see fixes in a reasonable time. So you've completed the CRP, processes and training docs are finalized. It's time for end user training. So these can vary greatly depending if you are 60 or 600 employees in 2 locations versus 200 locations, but here's a few guidelines on the timing and the process. So the end user retraining requires about 4 to 6 weeks to perform, and you'd want to start 6 to 8 weeks before launch. Resist the temptation to start too early, but do it early enough to address, so you can address issues that arise as the end users will find things the champions missed. Allow time for practice and adjusting processes. End user training. This is an important part of the process, so take the time to review that end users are logging in and that they are practicing putting in transactions. Their inquiries will be a good indicator of how much they are practicing. In other words, silence is bad. If they're coming back with questions and problems, that means they're active, and that's good. So if on site, champions should walk around to see what they are doing, offer to assist with any questions or obstacles. If they're not on site and you're working in a remote environment, offer to shadow on a Zoom meeting. So end user training. So it's based on working instructions and procedures. Training materials are built after each module and process is completed. And important, end user training is key in solution adoption. It gives users the perception of being able. Very important that your end users have to come out of this with confidence. They're on the front lines. This is an important phase. Finally, the go live phase. It's composed of the following: readiness assessment, the go live prep, and the go live launch. So, readiness assessment. Best practices for the RA, or readiness assessment, to be done by a consultant or one of the consultants who was not previously involved in the project. So the same company, but just not the lead consultant, let's say, on your project. So the RA, or readiness assessment, is done after the end user training. Typically, the RA will require 1 week to perform, and typically done 3 to 6 weeks before launch, so you have time to address any weaknesses. The assigned external consultant schedules an interview for each functional area. So let's say there's one session set up for AR, one AP, sales order processing, accounting, warehouse receiving, warehouse shipping. You get the idea. You've got 7, 8, 9, 10 different functional areas. Plan for 30 minutes per user, or per session would be 60 to 90 minutes. The RA follows a predetermined checklist. Okay, so you come up with your list of questions for each of these functional areas, and the checklist is shared with the operators who in advance. So when they're in this, they've had time to practice, they've had time to read the checklist. So when you're going through it with them, there's no surprises. Executives are strongly encouraged to attend. It gives them an idea of the readiness. This is important. This is a business. Once complete, you conclude whether a functional area is ready or not. If they're ready or not ready, is there anything they could do to be ready? For example, more practice, or did they just have maybe one process that didn't go well, that if they got 2 weeks to fix it, is that enough? I've got a little sample questionnaire on the screen. Not enough time to really go through it, but just to give the idea that it's basically a list of questions. You know, you're going to enter you're going to enter a pick. You're going to process different types of transactions. It's a checklist style process. You've passed the readiness assessment. All high priority outstanding items are resolved. It's time to proceed to the launch phase. So it's time for some checklists. Each task has estimated durations and is assigned an owner, so you have accountability. So you should draft a pre-go live checklist for the week prior to the launch, and draft a go live weekend checklist for the big weekend, which would be daily and hourly task lists. Note, the launch weekend usually starts sometime after Thursday or end of day Thursday and goes to the Monday morning. You'll also want to confirm and prep the launch week support teams, both internal and external. Week prior to the launch, communications, let's say internal. So emails to your staff and everybody who's involved, the end users, what to expect on the Monday morning. So you're going to work all weekend preparing everything. Assuming all goes well, Monday morning, they're launching, your end user needs to work. So what to expect on the Monday morning, who to contact for support. Let them know if the old system's going to be down, let them know their logins aren't going to work. Communications externally. Maybe you want to communicate to your reps so that they can, when they get questions from the customers, they'll be able to field them. Maybe you have some customers you want to communicate with. Maybe something's going to change. Maybe the look and feel of something's going to change. Maybe the Monday morning you're expecting 50% output. So communicate externally. Communicate with Infor. Get confirmation they're ready for the data migration. You may want to process any final pending transactions. You may want to confirm that all your license keys are installed. And of course, finalize your support plans, internal and external. So all went well on the launch weekend. The data is ready and balances. It's now launch week, Monday morning. Champions and support resources should be visible to the operators and the end users. Ensure the operators log incidents. Ensure the support team has a clear process to log, prioritize, and escalate incidents. Schedule daily Scrum or meetings with your project team where you recap the latest priorities so the team stays organized, focused, and positive. Keep the message consistent coming from the team. Communicate from the project team to the organization. You may want to do a daily recap for the first week. How are things progressing? They should be aware the company is in a launch week. There are issues. This is expected, but they should be aware. This should not be done in a vacuum. So you did it. You survived the go live phase. It's been a few weeks. The outstanding issues list has decreased. It's time to transition back to normal support. Congratulations. Now let's jump ahead 30, 60, 90 days. Plan for a periodic system review. We call them a 90-day review. And you review what's going well, what's next, where do you need help, keep the momentum going. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, please feel free.
Yeah, Mark, thank you so much. There's a lot of insight there in terms of doing this migration. And I would ask folks, please enter your questions into the chat box. I don't see any at the moment, Mark, so I'll kick it off with a couple of questions. So two questions I have for you, and they're kind of related. One is, what is NSA's experience with clients that actually have modifications in their older, on-prem systems to actually eliminating those, or maybe, being able to use extensibility to address them, just generally speaking. Yep. I know that every client's different. And secondly, yep, can you talk a little bit about extensibility versus mods and how that's different? Yeah,
so we'll perform a mod review with our clients where we actually get the long list, and the list could be from a few dozen to much more than that. We go through them. The first thing is, do you still need it? And that cuts the list down considerably, believe it or not, often 50%. The next one is we review it for new functionality. Has new functionality come along? The other items are, of course, and you want to get them out of the way quickly, is what are the big ones? What are the showstoppers? If you've got 6 months or a year on this project, you want to know these up front. If there's a valid functionality that was developed in GUI and you feel there's justification to bring it forward for other customers to use, an ERS, an enhancement request system submission for Infor, and getting and socializing it to get that mod put into CSD. If that's a viable option, you should get going on it early. What's left over would, you can either look at extensibility to replicate the mod on your own. You could also do code dev with Infor, and the cover is probably about 80% of the mods that you're going to come up with, or mod replacement initiatives you're going to come across.
Great, Mark, thank you. And we do have another question. So do you recommend companies complete process improvements before or after transitioning to CSD?
Yeah, good question. I guess the default is before. If there's anything you can do before, it helps. If it's something that's been functioning and it's going to add complexity to your migration, and there's no real benefit to doing it at the same time, you'll need to assess whether or not your team is already overloaded. So that's something you'll have to assess. And so if you feel that your launch dates are tight and you have enough change going on, if you can do it, great, but don't let it come at the compromise of hitting your target. Some process changes are, to me, they fall into two camps. They're isolated. It just affects one department, and it's very easy for a single department to change a process on their own. The problem is when you have a process change that goes across 2 and 3 departments, and that's where you need collaboration. And those become exponentially more difficult to land, to get completed, because you need multiple managers working together with multiple teams to iron out a change. And if that's the kind of change you're looking for, if that's the kind of that you're you're considering at the same time as this project, it could be risky in terms of how much time and effort it takes to complete that process change.
That makes a lot of sense. We're getting a nice flow of questions here, Mark. So the next one is, how can tech teams access data for reporting and other data export-import needs?
Can tech teams access data? Sorry?
Yeah, I think that's probably referring to the system that they're converting from, I'm guessing at this point. Jay, if that's different, please let us know.
So I guess the question could fall into two camps. If you need access to GUI, if you have the data in GUI and you have the opportunity to clean it up before, definitely do. It's easier to access your data in GUI than it is in CSD. That's number one. So if you can do it first, get it cleaned up in GUI and then CSD. Once you're in CSD, you have a couple of different options. If it's reporting, you can bring the data out to, let's say, Data Lake and do your reporting off of that. If you have any cleanup that you want to do, you would have to work with Infor. So your options become limited.
Okay,
is it
thank
possible to do SQL type queries where we do exports of data?
Well, exports, you depend on what your context is. If you're just exporting the data, there are mass maintenance functions. So let's say you want to export a list of customers or products, reps, make changes and then move the data back in. There's the mass maintenance functionality for that. If you're talking interactive SQLs where today you can write a QD to on the fly change some order line records, that becomes very limited in CSD. To write a SQL invasive affecting your tables real time would require Infor's okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Great, thank you, Jay. So another question from Hugh, how does NSA stay partnered with us as a transition to CSD, turn over our main support points of contact to Infor? And are we still, they say that they are still on a blend of Chewy GUI environment, use NSA support channels. And thank you for the plug, Hugh. He says our experiences at NSA support personnel are second to none.
Yeah, so there's a transition period. So I made reference to it in the presentation where you transition to normal support in the weeks that follow your CSD launch. So at first, everything would be funneling through NSA, let's say. But once things calm down, you would typically go to Infor for your system issues. You would submit incidents if there's a bug or something abnormal, and then you have different options. But then often, I guess NSA would be your consulting or value add partner, and you would go back to normal support.
Great, thanks, Mark. Another question we have is, in your experience, what challenges have you encountered when replacing custom mods / reports with out-of-the-box functionality in CSD?
Yeah, it varies greatly. I guess when you say mods versus reports, that's a broad category. For reporting, you should be fine because it's predictable and repetitive, and you can extract your data depending on the solution, the BI solutions you're using. Replicating any reporting should not be a problem. So I think the answer is that's a very high success and satisfaction rate with reporting. In terms of custom mods, I think the spectrum is wide. It depends how extensive your mod is to whether or not you can find a solution. And as part of this project, as part of your migration project, you want to identify those big mods from the get-go because they will take longer to replace and address
Thank you. This is a really good question, I'm sure on many folks' minds. And I know how busy NSA has been in the last, especially the couple of years, doing migrations to CSD. So the question is, how many migrations from CHUI to CSD has NSA completed to date? I guess roughly, who can give some indication of that?
I'd have a hard time answering that from a NSA perspective. We're 30 plus consultants. As an individual consultant, I'll work on a half a dozen directly and then support a few more from time to time. So if we're 30 different consultants, you know, you'd have to ask someone involved at that level at NSA to know the total count. I'd be guessing. Probably less than 100 and more than 50.
I would as well, Mark, but yeah, it's got to be north of 50. Again, to Mark's point, we have 30 plus consultants, and all of them are involved with CSD migrations. And the last 2 years in particular have been very, very, very active. But suffice to say, the team has substantial experience in doing these migrations.
Yeah.
So that's all I have so far. I'll leave the line open here for another minute or so if anyone has any final questions they'd like to ask.
Just something that I'll add to Rich's question and
please,
use.
Debbie.
I noticed the question asked about CHUI to CSD, and I don't know if we can lock down that number. Many of our clients are already on GUI, some on Web UI, but it's not to say that we don't have customers who are still using the CHUI interface, and we do successfully migrate them to CSD.
Yeah, that's a good point because it was specific to CHUI, but I know we have done many migrations from CHUI, but you know, again, overall, you know, it's kind of hard to know off the top of our heads what the specific number might be on that particular platform. Excellent. Well, I do appreciate all the questions that came in. Obviously, this is a very active and important topic for folks, especially late on a Friday. I guess that's a good acid test to see, you know, how truly important this is. Again, this session has been recorded. Everybody that's on the session today will receive a recording of the session. Mark has his information up on the screen, so if you have any specific questions for Mark, you know, please contact him. And certainly, we appreciate your time and attention on this particular topic. Mark, I want to thank you for a great presentation that you did, covering a lot of areas that are important for folks to consider.
You're very welcome, and thank you, Brian, and everybody else.
Thank you, guys. Have a wonderful weekend.